your source for everything paranormal. Para-X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
May the circle be open but unbroken. May the peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again. May the circle be open but unbroken. May the peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron on the Para-X Radio Network. And now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. I want to take just a quick minute to thank my producer Sarge for creating the new opener to the show. We're just playing it for the first time tonight. And, sometimes things need changing up as necessary, and he did a very great job of it. So, Sarge, thank you very much. Very well done. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about a new book by authors Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. And since 1989, Lynn and Clive have researched historical and religious mysteries, authoring such bestsellers as The Stargate Conspiracy, as well as The Templar Revelation, which inspired Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. They're frequent speakers at conferences around the world and regularly appear on TV series such as Forbidden History, Ultimate Spies, and Medieval Murder Mysteries. And tonight we're going to be talking about their new book, When God Had a Wife. As always, if those of you in the chat room have any questions or comments for my guests, please send me a private message and I'll pass it on. And if you're not here at Para-X and have a question, you better get over here quick and just come to paraxradionetwork.com and click on the chat link. Lynn, Clyde, good morning or good early morning, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us, Marla.
Hello. Yes, we were just dancing to your opening music.
It's brilliant, brilliant music.
Isn't it? I mean, I love that chant, and it just fits so well with everything. And then I didn't realize when I picked it, we were going to talk about the goddess and the divine goddesses tonight. So it worked out even better. So all right. So the subhead of the book is The Fall and Rise of the Sacred Feminine in the Judeo-Christian Tradition. And the book reveals the tradition of goddess worship in early Judaism and how Jesus attempted to restore the feminine side to the faith back in his time. And that was, pretty much simplifies the whole topic, which I think has many, many layers to it. But we're going to really dig into as many as we can tonight. But before we do a little bit of that, let's begin with the two of you, because if I'm not mistaken, years ago, before you even knew each other, you were both separately having backgrounds in the paranormal, and I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Well, absolutely. We met, actually, on the doorstep of a house where there was a lecture about the paranormal. So, that just about shows you where we're coming from. But I grew up in a haunted house. So I was, as many of you will know, if that happens, then your whole worldview is different from somebody who didn't grow up in a haunted house. So, I was already, to me, there's absolutely no doubt about the existence of the paranormal. I mean, obviously some cases, individual cases will be maybe a bit dodgy, but mine certainly wasn't. And I was already, if you like, a convert. Somebody a total believer. And then, as I say, I met Clive, who was already involved in researching such stuff.
Yeah, and I was more, I didn't grow up in a haunted house. Sometimes wish I had. But I was always had this interest in the paranormal and anything mysterious. Never really had any experiences, so I was kind of looking at it from the outside. So I read a lot about it, including I used to read a classic partwork magazine thing called The Unexplained, for which the deputy editor and who also wrote for it was named Lynn Picknett.
Yes.
So I knew his name before we met. Yes, as Lynn said, I was researching it. I was actually an investigator for Paranormal Society, but I used to be a Ghostbuster, but I wasn't very good at it. So then we met. We started working together. Had a few paranormal experiences since, of course, because I'd expect nothing less working with Lynn. But we both keep quite a, I think, not a detached, but an objective view of these things, which is something we try to put over in our work, in our writing.
Yeah, we're believers, but we're not credulous.
Mm-hmm. And open-mindedness is very important, but and also a tinge of skepticism, because you can't believe everything you see, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to believe it if you're a little bit skeptic. But cynicism is the worst, but skepticism, a little healthy skepticism, is good as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, because it enables you to be objective, as Clive said. That's the important thing, to look at something, in the cold light of day, as it were, and see all the facts and weigh the evidence. But I mean, the thing that we both object to is not skepticism, but it's sort of professional debunking, where you set out, no matter what the evidence is, to undermine something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we see a whole lot of that. And, you can't change it, but boy, you can kind of bite your lip when you see it. It really is out there. A lot of times people are just so determined to prove people wrong because they think they are right. They have the absolute answers to the universe.
Yeah, just as much a belief system or a matter of faith as the people that they're kind of fighting against. They just will ignore any evidence for the paranormal because they know it can't happen. But something that Lynn and I always try and do is actually kind of build bridges between the two sides, not with the kind of ultra skeptic you're never going to convince, no matter, even if you put them in a room with a poltergeist, you'd still never convince them. But we often try and build the bridge between the two sides to show that one side that there is quite a lot of evidence for these things, and the other side that they shouldn't just accept everything on completely face value. And that anyway, that's kind of something we're trying to do in the new book as well. Is actually kind of try and bring the two sides of a sort of academic approach and a more spiritual approach together. To show that actually they're going in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, you've written many other books, as I mentioned, including Stargate Conspiracy, which was about the truth about extraterrestrial life and the mysteries of ancient Egypt, and then the Templar Revelations, a book about the secret guardians of the true identity of Christ. And, you've written other books like The Shroud of Turin, The War of the Windsors. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different topics that you went to. So what was it that led you or compelled you both to write this latest book?
Well, yeah, you're right using the word compelled, because it was almost as if all our lives we've had to write this book, which sounds very grand, but actually it's true. Mm-hmm. When we wrote Templar Revelation, half of the book is about Mary Magdalene, because a marginalized character in the New Testament. And it was then that we sort of got intimations of the sacred feminine and how the whole sort of goddess culture, if you like, has been deliberately suppressed. And we knew that the whole subject was going to resurface in our work at some point. We got diverted many times from that, but finally it was, as you say, as if we were compelled to write this book. So finally she got us.
And I would be disappointed if she hadn't.
So would we.
Well, also, it answered questions that we've been asking ever since we wrote Templar Revelation. questions about what Jesus was really about, and questions that we actually couldn't answer, but we could speculate about way back then. And then the more we've researched over the years, the more we've realised that actually that there is a solution to this, which is in going back to the origins of the Israelite religion, and sort of it fills in the gaps perfectly for all these things that we hadn't quite got in the past.
And also, one of the things we learned writing all our other books, which are not remotely about this subject, but in general, is don't trust history, or rather don't trust, the official version of history. And one of the things we pride ourselves on is that we go back to all the bits and pieces of evidence that have led people to write history in a certain way and take it apart again and restitch it, if you like, to hopefully form a more truthful pattern.
It's very difficult when you think back that far because, if you go way back, it was oral history. And oral history is like Chinese whispers, right? It changes from person to person.
Yeah.
And then you have the people in later times that will read things that they hear, but then if they're going to transcribe them into something else, they will put their own spin on it.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking
and
that they're right. Yeah, so it's really, history is a very difficult thing, and I think you really have to dig, as you did, so deep to kind of come up with conclusions. And you're not saying, that everything that you're saying is right either. Nobody does that. But you are giving great evidence of things that you have found that probably others have not.
Yes, and also, a lot of what we say is really drawing together what scholars and academics have discovered, archaeologists and textual scholars. It's something else we've done in other books, is when you realise that there's all this information out there that has been uncovered, but it's kind of buried away in academic journals and very kind of specialised texts. And often they don't put it together either. So you'll have one scholar that's worked on understanding the meaning of a particular part of the Old Testament and discovered some amazing things about, how there is a goddess hidden in there. And then you'll have archaeologists who have found inscriptions that show that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, did have a consort, another half, and nobody's really stuck all that together and say, when you put it together, look at how much evidence there actually is for this, for the the veneration of the sacred feminine back in the days of Moses and the ancient Israelites. But then once you also put it together, you also start to make other connections that haven't been made before. And the thing particularly for us was to show how that whole strand of the suppressed feminine and the attempts to bring her back do have an impact on the origins of Christianity. This is where it answers those questions that we've been asking for 20 odd years.
And one of the most shocking things actually to us about the kind of material that we're revealing is that both of the great religions, Judaism and Christianity, they have academics associated with them, theologians, who have known some of this material for generations, for decades, at the very least. And the last people that will discover about this are the worshippers, the ordinary people who go to the synagogue or church every Sunday. They'll just be told the same old stuff with none of the new stuff. And it's actually quite shocking how this information has been withheld. Although, on the other hand, you can see why it's been withheld.
Yeah, very true. So what were some of the consequences of the suppression of the feminine in both Judaism and Christianity through the ages?
Well, it's the impact, of course, it has on, particularly on women in these cultures. Because, once you start to deny, suppress, pretend that there is no sacred feminine and that God's all male, and that's all you need to worry about. Of course, this has an impact on the way people treat women. Not to say that in many ancient cultures which did venerate goddesses alongside their gods, that they didn't treat their women particularly great anyway, but at least there was this sacred space for them that was acknowledged by the men as well. But once you've excluded her from the picture, you don't have a role for the women in the religion at all. You start to have all-male priesthoods. One thing that we've recovered in the book is the fact that actually there was a priesthood dedicated to God's spouse, whose name we haven't said yet. It's Asherah. And there was a priesthood that did the rituals and ceremonies that were hers, which included priestesses alongside the priest. It was a mixed priesthood. But of course, once you've taken the feminine out of the picture and just left with the male god, you don't need priestesses anymore. And what they started to do in creating the religion, when they started to put together what became the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, which they rewrote the history to pretend none of this stuff had ever happened, they start to actually kind of denigrate the priestesses and equate them with prostitutes and adulteresses. So you start to kind of smear all womankind then. It has this kind of huge impact. I mean, it's not good for the male psyche either, but it's particularly not good for the spiritual side of women who don't have anything to appeal to. And it's just not good for the day-to-day life of the woman. Yeah.
It's a very basic insult, isn't it? Implicit in all of this, that basically women aren't good enough to be to know God's will or to be the voice of God. They're just not good enough, and leave it with the men. They'll sort it. They'll be a hotline to God. You needn't worry your pretty little heads, dears.
There you go.
with these serious matters,
And of course, the impact it's had on only Western history, it's been huge. We don't have to go into that, because we're finally beginning to come to terms and snap out of that as a culture. But it all started because in our culture, the religion that was at the centre of it, or the two religions that were at the centre of it, they're the ones that created the sort of idea of women as being very much second class or even third class. So it's had a huge impact on every part of our culture, really, until now. We're only just really getting to grips with that.
Yeah, that's true. But so as I was reading along, certain things popped into my head. For example, being pagan, I've always recognized and understood the presence of the divine feminine and worshiping both gods and goddesses. But in my early life, I was brought up in a very loosely religious 50-50 household. Half the family were Jewish, half the family were Christian. So we celebrated all the holidays on both sides, which was, the best of both worlds. But nobody ever set foot in a synagogue or a church on high holy days. But I never gave a whole lot of thought to the aspect, the Judeo-Christian aspect of goddess worship, or lack thereof. And I didn't realize that an earlier form of Hebrew worship included both male and female gods. And I did notice, though, that Judaism was quite a matriarchal society in nature, and it's hard to believe that they could just go ahead and erase the divine feminine completely in that case, especially in Judaism's case, where the woman was the dominant, the alpha female, or whatever you want to call it. I don't understand. Was it fear, or what were some of the reasons why they were able, the church or the synagogue, were able to change history and just write them off? I don't know. It just kind of boggles.
In both cases, interestingly, in both Judaism and Christianity, officially, as it were, the sacred feminine was removed from both religions once the men started to codify the religion and write down the rules. So certainly, in Christianity, for example, you have when the Emperor Constantine and his successors basically said, right, from now on, Christianity is going to be the state religion of the Roman Empire. And this is what you're going to believe. This is what this is how it's going to be. And these are the books that are going to go into the New Testament. And actually that to me certainly is such a giveaway, because if you look at certainly a number of the books that we now know that were excluded from the New Testament, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, obviously, nominally, Jesus is the star of those books, but only nominally, because the actual star is Mary Magdalene. So you think, well, wait a minute, the ones in the New Testament, she actually hardly appears by name in there. Is there perhaps a clue as to one of the reasons why these other books were not included in the New Testament? So when, it's like when the religion was being codified and actually officially laid down, rule by rule and belief by belief, that was when the sacred feminine disappeared, essentially.
Well, I find it interesting if you go back in pagan history too, and maybe we don't have to go back a million years, but women they were called the wise women for good reason, Yeah. And I mean, I don't know, because this has been kind of a roller coaster between the men and the women all throughout history, as you said, the fall and rise, and we're going to get into that wordage in a few minutes because that really was good. But it's just this roller coaster ride, and people don't believe, let's say, as far as witches go, that they were anything but cackling devil worshippers who, sat around a cauldron all day and cast spells. And, when you try to tell somebody, well, no, they were actually the wise women. They were the ones that could create medicine from nature and blah, 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 blah. And people go, oh, shit, no, that can't be, If that was the truth, why aren't they still around? Whatever.
It's that, but as Lynn was saying, it's that kind of codifying of the religion. Because if you actually think back to the ancient pagan cultures, which, as I said earlier, particularly say the Greek cultures didn't treat women very well at all, but they still had that space for the sacred feminine. But the difference between the ancient pagan religions and modern paganism is that none of them really were codified. Nobody sat down and said, these are the dogmas and the doctrines that you have to believe in order to worship Isis or Athena or
Aphrodite.
Or anybody, and modern paganism isn't like that. They were kind of a loose collection of ideas and principles that you have in order to be a pagan, but it's not kind of, well, you must believe exactly this, otherwise we're going to kick you out.
Yes, we have no dogma, and that makes a big difference.
I often think of paganism as being a disorganized religion as opposed to organized one, which is its strength.
Well, actually, also, I mean, it's interesting because the whole idea of codifying a religion and saying, overnight, suddenly, you over there, you don't believe what you should believe, so you are heretics. We are going to punish you. That was unknown in the pagan world, but it was what the emergent Christian church did very quickly. And basically what they were doing was removing, if you like, the feminine energy, not just the sacred feminine, but the whole feminine energy, because suddenly it was about hard and fast rules. It wasn't about passion anymore. It wasn't about love anymore, love for the goddess. It was about, basically just knuckling down and doing as you were told, which was, very archetypal male energy. So the balance was gone. And, we're very big on balance, but it was a very imbalanced religion from the very beginning.
And just to, put it in the context of the book, is that this codification that we're talking about, which is when a canon of sacred text is drawn up, what Christians call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, that's when people go to all these oral traditions and start to actually prepare an official version, not just of the religion, but also of the history of how you get to be there. And that's when they start to rewrite the history. This process actually only happened in terms of the Judaic religion in about 350-ish BC. So quite late. When you consider, Moses is supposed to be around getting on for 1,000 years before that. Yeah. So there, at that point, that's the point when the sacred feminine is erased and the history is rewritten to pretend it was never there, or if it was a time of aberration and backsliding when some of the Israelites turned away from the true religion, which is reversing the actual position. She was actually a central part of the religion all the way through, and so this happens surprisingly late. And then when you go back into the period before that, that's where you get these inscriptions that actually have Yahweh and Asherah cited together in the same inscription, and all the other evidence, archaeological evidence of the images of her come out. But so it's a very late thing, and it's a time when the scribes and particularly the governor of Jerusalem decided, in a way for political reasons as well, that we really need to take control of this population, and therefore we need to set down exactly what they should believe and how they should behave. And that's as Lynn said, that's the point when it happens.
Yeah, and the actual language used about it, as it were, retrospectively about the worshippers of Asherah, it was violent language. This was an abomination, this worship. That really as strong as that. When in fact, as Clive said, it was the normal. It was the norm to worship Asherah and Yahweh together. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in Solomon's temple, this is the bit that got me. I mean, it's just amazing. In Solomon's temple, Asherah was worshipped alongside Yahweh. For a high proportion of the time that Solomon's temple was there. I mean, this was the official religion. It wasn't an aberration. It wasn't an abomination. It's what ordinary people did.
Mm-hmm. It's about 75% of the time that the temple was there, Asherah was worshipped in it, and there was about 25% of the time when, at the instigation of one of the prophets, it was taken out. But that 25% of the time is presented in the Old Testament as if that's the norm, where in fact, even on its own evidence, because you can tot up the years from its own, from what it actually says in the surviving books, actually contradicts its own message. The norm was to have the goddess in the temple and her priesthood, which included women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was kind of thinking that perhaps a lot of this came right after Christianity was created, because, they, after all, thought pagans were terrible people. They wanted to convert them to the new religion for fear of going to a place called hell, which they didn't believe in beforehand, and ruled by a fallen angel named Satan. There was a lot of that, and that's why I was going to talk about a timeline of when this started to tank, but as reading the book and listening to you, it kind of was a roller coaster ride. It was up and down for a while before it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing was, the various prophets, I mean, most of the people took no notice of the prophets, it must be said, despite the fact that they, the whole books, written by or dedicated to them in the Hebrew Bible. But when they were successful, they managed to get their influence felt by condemning the religion, the worship of Asherah, and she was removed from the temple during that time, and they tried to remove her from the people's consciousness. But one way or another, she, or the sacred feminine in general, clung on to the religion in sort of under the official religion, in among the hearts and minds of the ordinary people. So as you say, a roller coaster, in her official worship, but she was always there in one sort or another.
That's perfectly good. I like that. We will out. We're going to take a break, so we'll be back in a short 2 minutes. Everybody stretch and come back and join us.
Don't go away. There's more Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks right after these important messages.
Red, where are you going?
I'm going back to the Paranormal View, back where I belong.
Please, take me with you.
No, I'm through with everything here. I want to see if there's something left in life I haven't explored. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, Red, don't run to them. They talk about ghosts and hauntings, UFOs, and all kind of supernatural scary stuff.
You'll never understand, will you, Scarlet?
No!
Well, that's your misfortune.
Red, if you go, where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear. Line.
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
That's the Paranormal View with your host, Henry Foister, Jeffrey Gould, and Barbara Duncan. Every Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the Para X Radio Network.
Missed an episode of Stirring the Cauldron? Then be sure to check out marlabrooks.com and check out the archive. And while you're there, check out Marla's weekly Witches Oracle card reading. Explore the site to find many great resources, such as information on tarot, oracle readings, metaphysical consultations, and links to all of Marla's books. That's marlabrooks.com. Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
And we're here with my guests, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, and we're talking about their new book, When God Had a Wife. So we left off with the goddesses kind of being erased in history. But you've written a chapter in the book called Goddesses to be Reckoned With. And so what happened to those goddesses and the wise women? Because even if they were written out of history, wouldn't they have still existed in some form and still been a powerful force in their own right?
Yes, I mean they would have been, because that's the way of things. I mean, rather in European history, as you were talking earlier about the wise women, in culture that were regarded and condemned as witches, because people don't just change their ways that easily, particularly the kind of, if you like, the ordinary people. We were saying before the break that the goddess Asherah was worshipped in the temple as part of the official cult, and then the official cult was changed and she was removed. But it's like, and like most things, the other thing you have to remember about the Old Testament is this tells the story of the official cult and the elite. They're not really that concerned with just what the ordinary people out in the countryside are doing. So, of course, it will survive. But going back to the goddesses to be reckoned with, it wasn't just one goddess that the ancient Israelites venerated. There were others as well. And there was one particular goddess, a war goddess called Anat, who was very important to the Israelites in the early part of when they settled in the Promised Land. And if you think about the Old Testament stories, once they settled there, they spent quite a few centuries just fighting people, Philistines and whoever. So, either defending their territory or trying to extend their territory. So it was very much a warrior society in those early days, before it kind of settled down around Kingdom of Solomon, and Kingdom of David rather at first. So at that point, they had a great veneration for this war goddess called Anat, who is really scary.
Yeah, you didn't mess with Anat.
She's, I see her as kind of ancestor of, what's this super villainess at the moment? Harley Quinn, You have her in your mind, that's Anat. And I think the evidence is that originally Anat was Yahweh's consort or wife. They were paired. And then later on, as it kind of settled down into a more rural community, they kind of thought, Anat is not the best role model for our wives and daughters. So we're bringing a more kind of matronly one. But some Hebrew communities outside of Israel actually continued worshipping Yahweh and Anat together as a pair. Again, through to about the 300-400 years BC, particularly one community of Hebrew mercenaries in Egypt that actually had a temple which was dedicated jointly to Yahweh and to Anat. And for a long time, we, like most people, thought that this was something that happened late because this community was in Egypt and they'd probably adopted sort of ways from the pagans around them. But the more we looked into this, we actually realized that they were actually continuing the very, very earliest form of the Israelite religion before it had been through a reform to actually give Yahweh a different wife. And then it even continued after all the goddesses have been removed from the religion. And that's recorded, the temple was excavated, I think it was in the 1960s, and they found all these inscriptions and things to this community. There was Anat, and there was also, as you mentioned, a whole tradition of wise women. There was a whole tradition of counselors during war at this early time.
Yeah, who were women. The certain wise women in the Old Testament. It's very clear if you read it objectively that these women were called upon to give advice to the king or to the leader or to the elite. In times of grave danger to the whole community. Their advice was taken very seriously. And also, it's quite interesting that some of the prophetesses, such as Deborah, we know them as prophetesses, but actually, if you look at the clues about them, it's very clear that what they actually were priestesses of Asherah, of the goddess. It's not spelled out, but you can actually work it out quite easily. So there was this tradition of wise women who, apart from giving their advice to people about their daily lives, were there sought after by the leaders of the community, by the leaders of the nation, in times of danger and in times of war. So that was an enormous responsibility, and it fell to them.
Mm-hmm. It's probably coming to a shock of some people that are hearing it right now. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I say, but it's there. It's just you don't have to read kind of that much between the lines to reconstruct this. These wise women traditions by comparing different figures who are actually called wise women, and the roles that they play. As Lynn was saying in giving advice in times of war, but they also have the power or ability to actually take on people like, King David himself and criticize. So there's, a wise woman that does that. In another story, there's another wise woman that takes on one of one of David's generals, and then you have Deborah, who's gets involved in a whole kind of thing to do with war then, basically not just encourages but forces the general, puts some backbone into the general to actually go out and fight. So once you start getting these parallels and you start looking at the language that they use and how similar they are, you realise you're not talking the books. If you just read the books, they appear to be talking about just these isolated women who pop up and do something and go away. But when you start realizing that these women are all part of a line of a tradition that is going through, and it's connected with Asherah, the whole picture starts to really fall into place.
And sometimes it's really easy to suddenly realize who exactly these women were, what was their real role, because it describes, for example, them sitting under a certain type of tree to give their pronouncements, to bestow their wisdom on people, and this tree was sacred to Asherah. So, there they were, priestesses of Asherah, quite clearly.
Yeah. There was one particular goddess in Judaism that was revered, then nearly disappeared, but then she managed to make it back into Christianity in what might be referred to as a dubious form, and she's still with us now. Who is that?
This is everyone get ready for this. This is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was originally female. She's not anymore. Certainly in the Old Testament, the Judaic tradition, they did represent the Holy Spirit. It wasn't terribly important in their traditions, but they did have even after the suppression of the woman from the official religion, they still because of this great need for a feminine side to religion, she does keep creeping back in various forms, and one was the form of the Holy Spirit. So it's not terribly important in Judaism, but obviously it became extremely important in Christianity. Mm-hmm. And originally, that figure was most definitely feminine, and then at some point, when they created this, the church created this idea of the Trinity, trying to sort of juggle these kind of three sides to their religion, that made God, Son, and Holy Spirit. Suddenly, the Holy Spirit turned male, and has remained male ever since. But most definitely, no question at the beginning, that was a female entity.
And when she was in the Jewish version, the Shekinah, or the Shekinah, I always loved the idea of her. She's often described a bit like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, sort of darting around, being playful, being a favourite of God's, like a favourite child, but very close to God and a huge influence over him in many respects. And just the lovely idea of this rather unserious character. You think of the Christian Trinity as being this great serious thing that somehow you have to understand, except nobody does. But that 1/3 of it is this darting little Tinkerbell character, which I just think is wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I've got a comment from the chat room. She says, I read somewhere that originally Yahweh was part of another religious pantheon of gods. Do you know about that? Or comment about that?
No, the origins of Yahweh are actually a complete mystery. Because Yahweh just, unlike, for example, Asherah, that we've been talking about, was also a goddess that was worshipped by the Canaanites and in Egypt and other places, because these ancient peoples were quite fluid in exchanging or combining their deities, both male and female, and the same with Anat. And same with various other figures that appear in the Bible. But Yahweh is absolutely unique, and nobody really agrees where this concept of Yahweh came from. We argue in the book it's a very Egyptian concept, and it's probably... there were so many sort of candidates of who it could be based on. We actually go for the god Amun, but we're not 100% firm on that because it's impossible to be sure. So Yahweh in name, which is a name that doesn't actually mean a name, it's really a name that means I'm not going to tell you what my name is. I am what I am is what it means. It's a god that doesn't, obviously very unusually for the ancient world or for really any religion, he doesn't have a form or a representation. You're actually forbidden to represent Yahweh in the form of, a statue or something. Some evidence, very good evidence, that originally Yahweh was worshipped in the form of like a standing stone, but just as a simple, in a way, natural object. but there was never depicted in a kind of a human type form. Very unusual. So Yahweh is an oddity. It's very strange, but there are parallels with certain Egyptian deities. So if Yahweh was taken from an earlier pantheon, we think it would be the Egyptian one, and we argue the case in the book. But we won't. We're not as wedded to that as some of the other things we talk about, where we think the evidence is totally conclusive. But he is a mystery, Yahweh, that obviously there's something they're almost trying to cover up about him. Don't really know what it was. There's plenty of scope for more research, you see.
Well, that's the fun part of it. Now, Jesus and his rival, Simon Magus? I'm pronouncing it wrong. Okay.
Not sure. Magus, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, both of them were attempting to restore the goddess-worshipping religion of the Israelites. Now, who traveled with them as priestesses in this quest?
Well, I mean, obviously, I say obviously, but I think most people would guess that it was Mary Magdalene with Jesus. And in fact, she certainly did behave like a priestess, because one thing that most people miss, and it's there in the New Testament, is the explanation, if you like, of where Jesus got his term, his description of Christ from, because Christ just means anointed one. But there's only one anointing in the New Testament. And it's this very garbled story of the woman who anoints him with very expensive perfumed ointment. And the male disciples are horrified by the waste of money. But Jesus tells them that they don't know what they're talking about. Well, not in those exact words, obviously, but they don't know what they're talking about. And, she will be celebrated for doing this thing. She's prepared his body for the burial. In other words, she's marked him out for his fate. This was obviously an incredibly important ritual. It was the anointing. And this woman christened him, if you like. And this woman was not named. It's not named, but in the context, it's very, very clear it's Mary Magdalene. So she was the priestess who obviously had this enormous power and influence and authority in order to perform this ritual, which, of course, the men didn't understand and they hated and they didn't like her anyway. But, there was there was all that going on. But Jesus had a parallel which the church couldn't stand and was terrified of, because there was this guy called Simon Magus, who was very like him in, casting out demons, healing, preaching, almost exactly the same things. In fact, the two men were actually confused quite a lot, which, say, the early church was terrified of. And Simon travelled around with a woman called Helen, an ex-prostitute whose freedom he had purchased. And talk about, the embodiment of the sacred feminine. Simon believed and preached that Helen was literally a goddess. She had been a creator goddess. She had been reincarnated many times, and each time she'd been degraded further. And her destiny, if you like, was to be saved by him, and they would be an equal partnership. He obviously representing the male element and her the female. But this was sort of a huge cosmic thing being embodied and played out on earth through the two of them. And they actually, one of the things quite amuses us is that Simon, who was very knowledgeable indeed about the history of the Jewish religion, he was Samaritan, but it was, very similar. He basically he said, look, there were gods and goddesses at the beginning. At the very beginning, it says so in the early books, Moses' books, and basically, here we are. This is the new generation of this, but actually, all of the stuff, all of the commandments, all of the holy instructions, take no notice of them, because actually they were given to us through prophets of the bad God. So basically, the God of this earth, according to Simon, is a bad God that basically you take no notice of. So to that end, it is said that Simon and his followers lived a life of complete debauchery, promiscuity, and orgies. But that was kind of part of his religion. I'm not sure. I mean, the thing is that every single word we have about Simon and Helen has come to us from their enemies. So maybe, slightly, overblown.
When you start to read even what the enemies have said, and they often do actually quote his own words in order to condemn them. But once you start piecing them together, actually quite an extraordinary message came out. We've written about Simon Magus in a couple of our other books, but we never quite realised how extraordinary a character he was, and how knowledgeable, as Lynn was saying, about the real origins of the Israelite religion, which fits totally with what modern scholars are saying. It's quite uncanny. But the other thing he's saying, which is very relevant to now, is we talked earlier about when the religion is codified, when the goddess was written out of the Judaic religion, what went with it was this condemnation of women. And one of the signs of this, there's a word, if you look in English translations, you will find a description of what they call cult prostitutes. Now, the actual word, the Hebrew word, is word kadesha. It literally means holy women. So holy women, but they're so much associated in the Old Testament writings with harlotry and adultery and things. The associations are so much there that when you translate holy women into English, it's translated as prostitute. That's what that's what happened when the goddess was taken out of her religion. Now, what Simon Magus did, he came along, he took a prostitute and elevated her as a goddess and said you must worship her as a goddess. He's absolutely, even just as a metaphor, he's absolutely reversing what the temple priests had done. They'd taken holy women and turned them into prostitutes. He's doing the opposite. He's taking a prostitute and saying he's a holy woman. But going beyond that, he basically says, this is the problem that we've had with the culture he's talking about, is by doing this to women, we've damaged ourselves. So all our salvations, male and female, depends on us getting back and learning to respect women again. And how modern a message is that?
Well, exactly. And
2,000 years ago saying this.
Everything old is new again. You know that. That's what I want to round this out on, because we're running a little bit short of time. But as I mentioned earlier, the book subhead is the fall and rise of the sacred feminine, rather than the cliche about the rise and fall. So now we've talked a lot about the fall, but let's talk for just a couple of minutes about the rise. Has there been a noticeable rise in the Judeo-Christian traditions over time? And are we peaking now, or are we still climbing?
Well, people often say to us, isn't it enough that there are female rabbis and female priests in, for example, the Church of England, the Anglican Church? And actually, we say, no, it's not enough. It's not enough at all. Not that we're members of either or believers in either, but from their perspective, what would be useful is if they acknowledge the history of their own religions and say, this is what happened to the sacred feminine. It was there. This is only beginning the restitution. It's not in itself a breakthrough. It's actually a pathetic, new step that is not by any means recovering what was lost over the years. So I think it's only the beginning, very much the beginning, in understanding of the lost sacred feminine, the two great religions.
I wish we had more time. I really, really wish we had more time. But we may have to do this again. And I was going to say some of the other books are really compelling as well. So maybe if both of you wouldn't mind another sleepless night somewhere down the line, maybe we could talk about one or two of the other books.
That would be great. That would be great, Marla.
Absolutely love to. Can't believe how quickly the hour's gone.
Yeah.
I know. And so before it really goes, I want you to tell the listeners where they can find out more information about both of you, about this book, your other books, appearances, workshop, whatever you have. Go for it.
Well, we have our website, which is www.picknettprince.com. So it's our two names together, picknettprince.com, which tells people all about our books and us, and what we've been up to and what we're going to get up to, and people can buy the books through there. Obviously, you can buy them from Amazon and bookstores in the usual way, but it's always best for us if you buy them through the website.
Yeah, a lot better for us. Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Please do that.
I mean, it's from Amazon, the website, but we get a small slice of that.
Yeah, please.
It helps.
So, and obviously, you can buy the book there. And I hope people do, and not just because we like people buying our books, but we think, we wrote it because we thought we've got an important message. It's things we think people really ought to know, because when we found out about them, we realised how much we needed to know them.
Yeah, I mean, we're very much sharing these revelations. When we discovered them, we got overexcited and we and pieced it all together, and it's just wonderful. And people are fascinated. We're doing it on behalf of other people, of everyone, really. Mm-hmm. And we want to share all this so badly. Want to share this with everybody.
And it's food for thought. And someone in the chat room just wrote, "Oh, I need to listen again to this one. It's great." So already, the wheels are turning, and that's what's so important, to learn, to grow, to pay attention, and expand horizons, and maybe get new thought processes. And
absolutely. Just to stimulate ideas, look at what we said, check it out as well. Don't just take our word for it, but we put lots of references in there.
Oh yeah.
It's there really just to stimulate people.
And one more time, give out the website address, because there's a whole lot of things going on there that are amazingly good.
Right, it's www.picknettprince.com. That's picknettprince.com.
All right. Well, I again thank you for staying up before the roosters, or you're up. Yeah, you are up before the roosters. But I really, really enjoyed it. There are comments coming in the chat room left and right about how they enjoyed it as well. So again, hopefully we'll see you again at some point soon. And I want to thank everybody for listening in as well, whether live or on podcast. And until next time, everybody, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
The peace of the goddess be ever in your heart. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again. Merry meet again. Merry meet again.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Please join us again next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited.